So if you're watching this video, you might have been assigned an in-class debate, but you have no debate experience. In that case, never fear, because you too can learn how to debate like a boss. All you have to do is follow these 3 easy steps. First up, you're going to want to find your evidence. Then, bring your evidence together and build your arguments. Then finally, you're going to want to present effectively. So let's go into a little bit more detail. Your first step, finding your evidence, is probably the hardest step in the process, but also the one that I enjoy the most. Before you start researching, I would recommend writing down your initial thoughts on the topic so you have an idea of what your biases are and so you have an idea of what to look for when you research. Personally, I've found it helpful to write down argument ideas in bullet point format. Once you have all that down, it's time to go and investigate what evidence is already out there. A great place to start is Googling phrases that are related to the topic and seeing what comes up. In most cases, you'll be able to find great evidence at newspapers, news organizations, think tanks, and government sources like the BJS and the BLS. As a general matter, I would avoid opinion sites and sites that are clearly out of the mainstream. One step that a lot of beginning debaters forget is to find the original source of the information that you're planning to cite. To better illustrate this, let's take a look at an example. So let's say that I'm working on a debate about international policy as it relates to bees, and I come across this article. The key is not to stop here, because the article is probably just a summary of the evidence. Look at the title of the article and you'll see "Study Says" at the very end. That indicates that there's probably some fantastic evidence linked to in the body of the article. Sure enough, when I scrolled down, I found a hyperlink to a report. I can click on this and then use the information at the link for my arguments. If there's no hyperlink, just Google the source cited in the piece. As you're assembling your evidence, there are a few things you should keep in mind. One of the first is to check the dates. As a rule of thumb, you should go for the most recent evidence available. There's no hard cutoff date when evidence simply becomes too old to be applicable, but the newer your evidence, the better it will look to the judges. As you find evidence you like, it'll help you out to organize it. Most debaters use a document or a spreadsheet to keep track of their evidence. I recommend using a spreadsheet because I feel it allows me to organize and summarize my evidence most effectively. To illustrate this technique, let's take a look at an example. I've divided this spreadsheet into 3 columns: the information I like, the name of the source where I got that information, and the link to that source. This format makes it easy for you to keep track of the information that's actually relevant to your argument as opposed to having to page through an entire study every time. It also makes it easier to answer questions from the judges, your opponents, or the audience. It's probably best to track down around 5 to 8 core pieces of evidence and build your arguments around them. With all that established, it's time for step 2. Preparing your arguments. The first step of this process is to learn your evidence inside and out. Depending on what time constraints you're working with, you should be able to present key points from your arguments without referring to your notes too much. As you begin to assemble your opening speech, focus on the 2 to 4 best arguments you've found and arrange them in a simple, consistent format. I've found that both judges and audiences respond a lot better when they can understand what you're talking about. To make it easier for all parties involved, I recommend using the TELI method, which stands for Tagline, Evidence, Link, and Impact. Let's check out an example of this format in action. I've broken out this example using a spreadsheet so you can see the distinctions between the tagline, evidence, link, and impact. Your tagline is simply your argument summed up in one sentence. Your evidence is what backs that argument up. Your link explains how the evidence relates to your argument, and your impact is the expected consequences if the judge doesn't pick your side. Though they might appear a little bit disjointed on a spreadsheet, these elements actually flow together really well, as you'll see. My first argument is, if we do not take decisive action to reverse the extinction of pollinators, we will risk losing much of the world food supply. According to a 2016 study conducted by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, 16% of vertebrate pollinators are threatened with extinction, with the trend being toward more extinctions. This situation has wide-ranging implications as a huge percentage of the international food economy is dependent on the work of pollinators, up to $577 billion in crop value alone each year. Therefore, if the international community does not implement the steps that I am advocating for, we may face an unprecedented global famine and the decimation of the international economy within the next 2 decades. What I love about the TELI format is that it allows you to make a fully fledged, easy to digest, and succinct argument. With that in mind, let's move on. As you're preparing for the debate, it's helpful to think about arguments that you might face from your opponents. Talk with your team about these arguments and think about how you might rebut them. If you want to come to the table really prepared, you can write down these counterarguments and bring them into the debate with you. Remember that you may be asked to take a position that you don't personally agree with. While you're researching your evidence, concentrate on the side that you don't already agree with and learn to present it as if you do agree with it. Finally, spend a little time thinking about what the judge's potential biases might be. If you know who's judging, a little research can go a long way in telling you what kind of arguments your judges will be most receptive to. So now it's time for a little review. First up, it's important to find and organize evidence from reputable sources. Second, it's important to be consistent in the way that you organize your arguments, whether you're using the tele format or not. Otherwise, your judges and audience may lose track of what you're saying. However, during the debate, you should never reveal if you personally disagree with the arguments that you're presenting. Finally, don't forget to consider what arguments the other team might bring to the table. So now we're moving on to the last step in the process, presenting effectively. Now, whenever I talk about presentation technique, I always like to share a saying that's totally old and wise and whatnot. And that is, you want the judges to vote for you, not against your opponents. You can make this happen by being professional. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, first of all, dressing well. Second, I mean comporting yourself with courtesy and decorum at all times. Remember, this is not a presidential debate. Thirdly, I mean delivering your presentation to the judges, not at your opponents. Remember who you're trying to convince. Fourthly, I mean speaking clearly and deliberately. Try to minimize filler words. The second way you can deliver a presentation that earns the judges' votes is by listening at all times. During the debate, you should jot down what your opponents say so you can remember it when it comes time to rebut them. This is also a great place to jot down notes on how best to rebut them. If you're not presenting first, take the opportunity to listen to what the other teams say and watch the judges' reactions. You can make tweaks to your arguments if you hear better ones. Also, make sure your entire team is involved. If only one person does the talking, it can look very awkward. Finally, remember to introduce yourself at the beginning and conclude at the end. An example of a good introduction might go something like this. Hello, my name is Peruna Mustang, and I am arguing in favor of the United Nations funding research on combating the extinction of pollinators. My first argument is blah blah blah. A good conclusion might go along the lines of this. For these reasons, it is critical that the UN fund research on mitigating the extinction of pollinators, and I would urge the judge to vote in favor of this position. Thank you. So now that we've got that down, let's talk for a moment about perceptual dominance. This is pretty sick as pictures of bees go, wouldn't you agree? Anyway, perceptual dominance. Often the most successful teams are the least combative ones. This is because being a jerk in a debate makes you look like a desperate fool. To avoid this perception, try to appear calm, confident, and prepared. This is how you build perceptual dominance. In sum, if you appear to be in control, people will assume you are. I've found after much rumination that this principle also applies to real life. Anyhow, let's conclude with a word on debate prep. Once you learn the debate topic, you should come together as a team, discuss ideas for arguments, and delegate harder than you ever have in your life. In my experience, the more specific you are about who takes on which responsibilities at the outset, the better your debate turns out to be. Well, folks, that pretty much wraps it up. Thanks for watching, and happy debating!